Of course, it's a wonderful and very important research and a very important topic. But in philosophy, this is rather a new discipline, a new subdiscipline, because what prompted me to try to establish this discipline is seeing that many psychologists, sociologists, linguists give only in their seminars on humor one lecture about the prehistory of the field, which would be the philosophy of humor. So I thought that this is misrepresenting the field of philosophy. And although I was part for the last 40 years of an international association for the study of humor, which was an interdisciplinary group of people meeting every year for a conference in many places in the world, philosophers would not come to these conferences because it was interdisciplinary and they needed more disciplinary conferences, I think. So I had no choice but to create an international association for the philosophy of humor after many years of trying to attract philosophers to those conferences. And I created this association in 2014. And we have for the moment 170 members. Membership is free. I will pass you the details if you'd be interested in joining. We have representations in all the American Philosophical Association divisions in the Eastern, Central, and Pacific divisions every year. And we have every year an international conference as well, one time in the United States and one time outside of the United States. So this is one thing I want you to know about, because really this enables us to bring scholars from all over the world in all of the disciplines of philosophy, continental and analytical, also from the East and from the West, to join together to establish this subdiscipline. So we must mention, of course, John Montreal, who has published most of the books in the philosophy of humor prior to the establishment of the association. John Montreal has agreed to be the honorary president of the association. And I should also mention that I was accorded the great privilege to found a new journal on the topic called The Philosophy of Humor Yearbook. Now, the first issue is out and it's free for 2 years. I can also extend the link to you. It's 350 pages of publication on the philosophy of humor. It intends to be, because published by the great publisher in Berlin, De Gruyter, it intends to be a very prestigious, very academic, very good publication, but it also includes, according to my wishes, 2 additional parts, apart from the academic articles. There is a part that rekindles the use of humor in writing philosophy, a part in which some articles use humor or satire in order to make the point when it's necessary. And there is a part who investigates the pedagogy of philosophy using humor. So how can we use humor to teach better philosophy? And of course, there are reviews of books. So if you have anything to contribute to this journal, please send it to me and just specify to which section you would like to contribute, or if there is a book you think we should review, please let us know. So the journal has 6 associate editors from around the world in different fields that address the philosophy of humor. Finally, we are founding a book series on the philosophy of humor. So it's a pity I didn't know that there was a conference a few years ago and there's a book. If there is another book or an anthology of articles, please feel free to send it to me. and receive a contract and be part of this great series, again by the great publisher, the Greuter in Berlin. Finally, the last thing that I would tell you about these organizational aspects of the field, there is a handbook to be published by Paragraph Macmillan of, I think, 54 chapters that would establish right the field, and of which I am the editor. So before telling you what it's important to establish in the field, I think, let me just ask, now it's 5 minutes to some hour here, how long do I have to talk? 35 minutes more or more? Can someone answer me?
Yes, ma'am, maybe 30 to 35 minutes. Okay.
So you won't believe how many great scholars I managed to get for the board of the journal and for the book series, and how many more scholars like Martha Nussbaum compliment the idea of having established this field. Apparently, there is a need for that, because the whole history of philosophy with the comical has not been so well represented in the literature. And I just recently found the reason I think this is so. You see, I just finished another book on the philosophy of humor, and I discovered that irony that philosophers prefer to humor or to laughter is actually rejected by most philosophers. From Aristotle on, it is rejected. And Derrida, the deconstructionist that is considered ironic, never uses the term and never applied it to his vision, nor even to postmodernism, which is considered, one of the main fields that endorse irony. So after scrutinizing all the schools and the relationship with irony, it is very interesting to see that they all reject irony, except from the German romantics. Now, the great scholar of antiquity, Alexander Nehamas, even states that we value irony only from the 19th century on. Before that, the account given of Socrates by Xenophon, was more appreciated than Plato's account. So we become to take more seriously and prefer Plato's account because of Plato's irony. And we became to be interested by Plato's irony through the Romantics. So why do I tell you all that? Wrongly or rightly, irony, humor, or laughter are considered part of aesthetics. I don't know why, I don't see why. But aesthetics was created only indeed in the wake of Romanticism, because aesthetics deals with art, and the Romantic put the emphasis on art. So from that moment on, irony received a big press in aesthetics and made us believe that in the history of philosophy, the main relationship of philosophers was with irony, which was not so. The same happened with tragedy. We really believe that philosophy has a deeper connection with tragedy than with comedy. And again, it's the same reason. It is because aesthetics was created at the end of the 18th and the 19th century. And this is the time with the Romantics that tragedy receives a big press. But actually, when we look into philosophy and philosophy's history, we see that from its inception, it was created as an alternative to tragedy. Because if we're talking about Greek times, what Plato wanted to avoid was the tragic view of the world and the tragic interpretation of goodness and badness and human mastery of his own fate. It is true that he wanted also to oppose comedy, the comedy of Aristophanes, which he considered responsible in part for Socrates' death. But it's mainly against the tragedians and their view of life that he goes against. You may be astonished to know that in the laws, he says that it's important to play comedies. Of course, slaves are going to play the comedies and not free men, but it's important to the contrary of tragedies that won't be played. Comedies will play, he says, because human can understand things only by their opposite. So it's important in a pedagogical way of view, in an epistemological way of view, to show comedies to the citizens in the law. So this is only a part of the revision that has to be made in philosophy's relationship with the comic, with comedy, with laughter, with humor, instead of continuously arguing that philosophy has indeed a deeper connection with tragedy and irony. It is true that laughter has a bodily effect has not attracted philosophers and cannot attract so much philosophers. Philosophers actually dealt from the beginning with the nature of laughter. It's interesting. They all wanted to know what laughter is, and they gave definitions of laughter. They also were very intrigued and worried about the ethical purpose of laughter. So they sought to find guidelines in order to explain if laughter is good or bad and how can it be best used for the benefits of the community. And sometimes they were also worried about the political aspects of laughter. So these were the three main interests of philosophers. And as the Honorable Pro Vice Chancellor mentioned, indeed it is true that only in recent times, as I tried to show in my book of 2014, from the 18th century on, was laughter given an epistemological role and then later an ontological role in human existence. Although I had a comment that it harks back to Plato, someone who read the manuscript commented that already in Plato it has an epistemological role, but it has been developed in modernity by the third Earl of Shaftesbury, and then taken over by a few others, till we reach also the view that the comical has an ontological basis. But because of the way various disciplines approach humor, the comic, or laughter as a kind of prehistory that they cover in one lecture. You know, they divide laughter theory, superiority, release theory, and incongruity theory. So, like in all history books, you know, you have the heroes and you have the villains. Because now the hero is the incongruity theory, everybody that says something about something that looks like incongruity is the good man. Everybody that talked about superiority or release, superiority is a very bad man, release is so-so. But nobody undertook to have a good look at the relationship of philosophy with the comical since its inception to this day. So I had to do so. And what I found out was no less than revolutionary, because I too only knew of the books told us, as the poor vice chancellor said, Plato's rejection of comedy or the comical, and Aristotle book on tragedy, and not the book on comedy that maybe was lost, etc. So what I found out is the following. Philosophy entertains with the comical very deep and sustained relationship from ancient Greece to this day. I can found 10 traditions that begin really at the beginning of philosophy in the pre-Socratics, and then Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the sophists at the same time that with Socrates, and those that came before Socrates and the sophists. And these traditions, which I'm trying to present to you now very shortly, actually continue in the history of philosophy to this day. This is what amazed me when I tried to show the deep relationship that modern philosophers have with the comic and laughter. I began with Montaigne in the Renaissance and I finish now with postmodernism. I saw that all these modern philosophers knew very well antiquity and were reviving traditions from antiquity, of which we don't know enough, because we, modern scholars, we know either antiquity or modernity. We generally don't know both. So I had to look hard enough in antiquity to find these traditions. So let me introduce them shortly and briefly, and I apologize if it's a little bit sketchy. If you want, I'll send you an article about that. First of all, let me introduce two traditions that may explain why we have the impression that philosophy has no relationship with the comical. One is the Agelastos philosopher. Agelastos means the philosopher that does not laugh. And this begins with Pythagoras. Pythagoras was renowned as someone who never laughed, thought the philosopher shouldn't laugh, and this is how he and philosophers were portrayed on the Greek scene. The Agelastos philosopher continued throughout the history of philosophy, receiving good press from Christian philosophers in the Middle Ages and from others, and accompanies us to this day, because philosophers considered that writing philosophy should be a very serious business, a grave business that excludes laughter. We have also another tradition, the mocking sophist. The sophist told Aristotle, at least as he recorded them, they told people that you have to fight the seriousness of your opponent with jest, and to fight his jest with seriousness. They made of the comical weapon in rhetorics. And because the comical was associated from the sophist on with rhetorics, philosophers who wanted to distance themselves from rhetoric, not address the emotions like the sophist, but instead reason, so attempted to avoid jest or humor or laughter. Although I can give you a long list of philosophers who make use of this kind of weapon in their writing. Hobbes, Pascal, many others. Also, of course, Plato, if you read his dialogues with attention, many more indeed. And many more who endorse the necessity and of mockery or scorn, for example, Descartes, in order to advance a cause in philosophy. But these two traditions combine, the mocking philosopher and the philosopher who doesn't laugh, or the Agelastos, actually together made us believe that philosophy has no relationship with laughter or the comical. But if we look more closely, we see that the philosopher with whom both science and philosophy were allegedly created, Thales of Miletus, he is referred not only as the most knowledgeable man of all times, He was a mathematician, he was, of course, an astronomer, and he was a philosopher, but also as the ridiculous philosopher. You may remember the anecdote that has been associated with him, that looking at the stars, he fell in a well that was at his feet. And Plato, who records this anecdote, adds that he had a servant that laughed at him. And Plato generalizes the anecdote and makes it characteristic of all philosophers that are being laughed at, and also connects that with the death of Socrates, because philosophers are ridiculed, and this is a first step toward bringing them to death. They are in danger. So the ridiculous philosopher is the first association that philosophy has with laughter. We can follow this anecdote in various guides in many philosophers. You won't believe it, till Heidegger in the 20th century, and as I said, revived by Plato and changed a little bit every time. In the Middle Ages, it becomes an anecdote also that laughs not only at the theoretical philosopher, but also at the theologian that does not actually practice faith in everyday life, but just deals with the abstract entities of theology. And always philosophers, when they went to the abstract on the instead of emphasizing the concrete as well, everyday life, they were laughed at in this way. So the ridiculous philosopher is the third tradition. The fourth tradition is the laughing philosopher. I don't know if you know, but Democritus, you know, the atomist of the 5th century before Christ. Of course, Thales was 6th century before Christ, and Pythagoras as well. So the 5th century before Christ, Democritus got the nickname after his death of the laughing philosopher. And this is very important because he was called wisdom during his life. So to associate the man that was considered the most wise one with laughter shows us that there is an idea in the West that links laughter with wisdom. This is very interesting because we have this in the East. We have this, of course, in Hinduism. We have this in Taoism, which influenced Buddhism, and creating also the laughing Buddhas of China that became the laughing Buddhas of Chan Buddhism that later becomes Zen Buddhism in Japan. But ask any Western scholar, usually he doesn't know that there is a fantastic tradition of laughing philosophers in the West. And from Democritus on, although the story begins in the Hippocrates, the great doctor, apocryphal letters, it's just a legend that he was called to cure Democritus, who was laughing about everything and everybody thought he was mad. And then he got convinced that the true sane is actually Democritus, because true sanity means to laugh at everything. And Democritus explains what he is laughing about. So we had many laughing philosophers since Democritus on. And those philosophers actually related themselves to Democritus. We have Erasmus, we have Montaigne, we have Santayana in the 20th century. Nietzsche tried to revive this as well, and many others. You know, Thomas More was considered a laughing philosopher by Erasmus, and Georges Bataille, the French philosopher, which is part of the last book, and others. So this is an interesting tradition, the fourth one, the laughing philosopher. But if you continue a little bit and you get to Socrates, you see that Socrates is presented as a ridiculous philosopher, but also as a laughing philosopher at the same time. Socrates is presented as humorous rather than ironic in Xenophon account, and presented humorously in Aristophanes' play, of course. So in Xenophon accounts, he says that Socrates used to joke a lot, and that you may learn from a great man no less by his jokes and good humor than when he is serious. So it's the comicality of Socrates that we should address. Socrates not only is portrayed as a ridiculous human being, a paradoxical human being, because he's very ugly in a society in which everybody puts the emphasis on the body. They didn't know that you can have a beautiful soul in an ugly body, but his constant use of jokes and humor and his examples of everyday and low life was something that was considered very unusual. And is being ridiculous and comical at the same time and laughing at the same time makes us understand that we need a special term for him. It can be either the comical philosopher or the humorous philosopher, because it's very important to notice that the primordial teacher in philosophy, Socrates, is associated with laughter or humor and the ridiculous in everything you look at him. Sometimes it's called irony in Plato, but most of the times it's humor and laughter. So this is very interesting. The comical philosopher would be a philosopher that uses his persona in order to attract laughter and then redirect it towards values that he wants to destroy. So people begin by laughing at the philosopher because he is an outsider. He embodies values that nobody can recognize as values because he is actually transgressing some norms. But he takes that laughter and redirects it toward the values of society that he really wants to abolish. And it's easier to abolish values through laughter. So this will be the tradition of the comical philosopher that you would find again and again in the history of philosophy when you want to educate through philosophy. For example, Kierkegaard would use that in his writings and many others. So this is one more tradition. And moving from Socrates to Plato, we have 6 traditions of philosophy, because when you look at Plato's dialogues, you see that they are comedic. Some of them are actually farces. So whatever Plato says about laughter, his use of it is quite expanded. And it's very interesting to see how he uses laughter in order to advance his argument, and how much laughter there is in Socrates and others, and the way the dialogues are being presented as some kind of comedies. Actually, Plato tries to bring good news in philosophy against tragedy. These good news take the form of a comedy. And even when we look at what Plato said about laughter, we see that he gave it a very interesting definition. He says that laughter shows self-ignorance in those who are not powerful. In the Philebus, he says that 48 to 50. So showing non-self-knowledge or ignorance of oneself, this is exactly what Plato wants to abolish. So he associates laughter with the main philosophic purpose, which is to bring us to self-knowledge. So the ridiculous is not the person who is being portrayed on Aristophanic stage, and other writers of comedy. The truly ridiculous is the person who ignores himself. So here we have a way to look at some of the misunderstanding that we have about philosophy's relationship with the comical. philosophers not only gave definitions of what the comical or laughter were. When they gave these definitions, of course, they followed the norms of their societies. Otherwise, nobody would have recognized that we're talking about laughter or about the comical. But philosophers, as usual, also give a normative view of what something is, not only a descriptive view. And as long as we were only concentrated on definitions of laughter, we were missing these normative views. So when Plato says that about laughter, he doesn't portray laughter as it is on the Greek scene, on the Greek theater. He portrays laughter true role and what the ridiculous truly is. And when we look at this in philosophers' writing, when we look for the normative way philosophers define laughter and its real role in life, in ethics, in politics, we begin to understand that we have missed half of the story and the most interesting one. So this is why I have decided in my studies to focus not on what laughter is, but what is its role in the good life that philosophers have offered us. Because every discipline talks about the good life today, medicine, psychology, sociology, anthropology. How come that philosophers, that all of them wrote about the good life, how come I thought that they didn't address humor or laughter? So then I looked into philosophers to find if they ever gave laughter or humor an important role in the good life that they offered. And I found that 9 philosophers in modern times did. But this was all created by understanding from Plato that there is a descriptive level and there is a normative level. And when you go to the normative level, you get the best of what the philosopher can offer you about laughter, humor, and the comic. So the 6th tradition, going back to antiquity, is that philosophy is comedic. You have 2 examples. You have one of Plato's dialogue and the other of the cynics that actually gave you a very physical comedy. If you look at what they did, the way they tried to attract attention and the way they tried to exemplify how easy it is to get the good life as long as you transgress, if necessary, the values of society. So they were showing you a shortcut to virtue, and they were showing it physically with public masturbation, with Diogenes entering a theater when everybody was leaving. And he said, you know, they wrote very, very serious treatises, the cynics. He said, I tried to write serious things, nobody read, but when I did something funny or something unexpected, everybody listened. So this is the cynics that help us define the 6th tradition, which is philosophy as comedic, which encompasses Plato and the cynics if we're talking about antiquity. The 7th tradition is very interesting because it comes from Aristotle. Not everybody notices that in the Nicomachean ethics, wit or eutrapelia is considered a virtue. It's actually the mean between a buffon that makes people laugh about everything and all the time, and about another vice, which is to be without humor. For the Greeks, to be humorless was a vice. So wit or the eutrapelia, the middle way between the 2 vices, is the virtue of the social man. And it's interesting that Aristotle said that you shouldn't fix ethically or even politically what good laughter is. You should let the great souled man show you the way in that. And of course, it shouldn't be excessive, not going in any one of the excesses of the vices, as most of Aristotelian virtues are. So this idea that eutrapelia, or if you want, a good sense of humor or wittiness, is a virtue, even if a social or a minor one, accompanied many centuries of philosophical thought. It was rejected by Christianity in the Middle Ages, but was rekindled after that. So it has a history of its own. But in Aristotle, we find also the origin of another very important tradition of laughter. It's laughter as the mark of the human being. But we find it by error in Aristotle. Actually, Aristotle says that the human being is the only animal that laughs. But he says that talking about physical laughter, the laughter of tickling, and he says that in a text called On the Parts of Animals, and it doesn't mean in this context humor. But this idea was taken from Aristotle and developed, especially in the Middle Ages, as something that has to do with another mark of the human being in Aristotle, which is rationality. So rationality and the capacity to laugh, homo ridens, the theory of homo ridens in Latin, was a very, very well established tradition in the West, and having impacted not only philosophers and theologians but also artists and poets. And even Sartre, if you want to talk about the 20th century, talks about that. So it had a huge impact. It actually created theological problems in the Middle Ages, because if Christ is considered to be man and also God, how comes in the New Testament he doesn't laugh? So if he's a man, he's supposed to laugh. So there were prizes given to people who could write dissertations about this topic. Laughter is the mark of the human would be the eighth tradition, and the last one that begins in antiquity. The ninth and the 10th tradition are traditions that I think begin in modernity. As the Pro Vice Chancellor said, laughter is epistemologically valuable. And finally, the comical is grounded ontologically. So the ninth tradition, that laughter is epistemologically grounded, as an epistemological role, is being very forcefully argued by the third Earl of Shaftesbury in the 18th century. He really sees the comical as a tool that brings us to truth. This is so because the universe is harmonious, he argues, in attempting to establish the goodness of the human being and of God. But we cannot actually see that if we address the universe in bad humor. Only when we are in good humor can we see reality as how it is. Not only that, the truth must withstand the test of the ridiculous without fear. We shouldn't interfere in the liberty of laughter, he says. We should leave it free in the country, because the ridiculous the truth would withstand any test, also the test of the ridiculous. And he was using this kind of humorous criticism in order to let false ideas dissolve. He was also giving advice on the 20th century not to fight in any way the enthusiasm, that means the mysticism of some sects, but to let laughter go its way in order to dissolve enthusiasm or mysticism. And he was using this kind of self-critical laughter in order to improve himself in his notebooks. So the epistemological value of laughter continues from there through Shaftesbury, immense influence, which I managed also to show as the basis of Kierkegaard, that this wasn't known, and others as well. Finally, laughter is ontologically grounded. This is most recent. This is the 20th century. This is Santayana, the Spanish-American philosopher, but this is also Clément Rosset, the French philosopher who just died, that really say that the comical not only reveals the ground of things, but is one aspect of reality, all existence, in the fact that it pops out, exists and disappears, is comical. Jose even says that he's the only one that makes the comical a feature of the real that actually can explain why we laugh at all, why we find some truths laughable, because they actually reveal the true ground of things. Okay, my dear colleagues, I think I have reached the end of this lecture. I wanted to say that my own contribution is not only 3 books on the relationship of modern philosopher with the comical, with the role they gave laughter and humor in the good life, beginning with Montaigne and finishing with postmodernism in a trilogy, but also these 10 traditions will be the basis of a book for the Goethe, for the book series I told you about. Finally, I have my own view of the role of humor in the good life. I have devised a new worldview that I called Homo ridiculis, the ridiculous human being, that is, if you want, something that from the Middle Ages on, very few people take from Homo ridens, from the laughing human being, and makes into another point that the human being is the only one that is being laughed at. And when you combine that, you arrive at a worldview that I have developed in a 2019 book on the human condition and philosophy and humor, the ridiculous human being. Thank you very much.